Pastor Ethan here again.
How you doing?
Just wanted to kind of follow up on yesterday's lesson. We started talking about the will of God. And different aspects of the will of God is looking at the sovereign will of God, the sovereignty of God. We hear that word every once in a while. And what does that mean? What does sovereignty mean? Luke talks about when it comes to the sovereignty of God's plan in the crucifixion of his Son. Luke talks about in Acts chapter 2, verse 23, him, okay, that's Jesus, being delivered by the determinate counsel and foreknowledge of God, ye have taken, and by wicked hands have crucified and slain.
And Ethan, in that passage, it says a determinate counsel, and that doesn't mean that the counsel was determined. It means that God had foreordained that counsel to be a part of the will or the sovereign will of God.
And that's what we see throughout all of the gospel story, is God using wicked men to fulfill his plan. And when we look at what happened in the crucifixion, is God used these men sometimes even against their own will, and maybe even in a way that they never thought that they would be actually used of God. But when God gave of himself, I've heard it said when it comes to the gospel is, God crushed God. It wasn't anything that God forgot or lost control of things. Things got out of hand and he forgot what was going on. But he allowed himself, he submitted himself to the will of the Father. Jesus did, and sacrificing himself for our sins. So when we look at the gospel and what that means for us is God, from the beginning, knew that he was going to sacrifice himself and give of himself so that we can have redemption, so that we can have salvation.
Yeah. So then what Christ did when he hung on the cross was that he shed his blood, and the Bible says that he died and that he was buried, and then he rose again the third day, according to the Scriptures. It's not according to the will of men, but according to the foreordained will of God. What an amazing thing to see.
So also then, not just in his death, but we're kind of going maybe a little backwards here, but to look at God's sovereign will even in the life of Christ. A couple of chapters later, in chapter 4, verses 27 and 28, says, for a truth against thy holy child, Jesus, whom thou anointed with Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, were gathered together, for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done. So even the life of Christ and everything that he accomplished in his life, his ministry with his disciples and all of these things, his life was all a part of the sovereign and perfect plan of God. And God used that to change the world, we see.
Yeah. Important to notice in that passage you just read, it even talks about Herod and Pilate, Pontius Pilate playing into the will of God, into that sovereign will of God. You see, oftentimes we look at these situations that we find ourselves in and we think, well, this is something that has happened and maybe we don't think it in our minds, but somewhere we get this idea that maybe God missed something and God didn't know about this or didn't catch it. But even this terrible, wicked event that happened at the hands of Herod and Pontius Pilate, where Jesus Christ goes to the cross, even those things are by the will of God. It even goes as far as to say, this holy, even as a child, when he was a child, Satan knew who he was. Satan was the one that was coming after him, and we think, well, that was of Satan. No, that was part of God's sovereign will. And Ethan, not only does the Bible talk about God's sovereign will in the crucifixion and also in the life of Christ, but the Bible also talks about God's sovereignty in Christ's worship. In Revelation chapter 13 and verse 8, it says, and all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the Lamb's book of life, slain from the foundation of the world. The Bible tells us there's going to come a day that even those people who reject Christ on this earth, those people who have spit in the face of God and said, I don't care who you are, I don't care anything about you, maybe even those people who said, I refuse to believe in God. The Bible says that there will come a day when those people's knee will bow, and they will bow before God and they will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. What an amazing God we have. It's amazing to sit and to think that one day every single person on this earth will worship God, regardless of what their thought process is here on this earth. One day, all will worship God. And I'm just glad that that's the God that I serve. And when my knee goes that day, it won't be the first time that I ever bow my knee to Christ. So thank you very much for listening today. I hope the Lord blesses you. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Have a great day.
We'll see you later.